Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasiya Lavrina. Today we focus on a relationship once championed as a cornerstone of United States engagement in the Caucasus, now hanging in the balance. Georgia, a country that has contributed troops to United States-led missions, hosted joint military drills, and embraced Western reforms, is now being met with silence from Washington. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze has made a direct appeal to President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, seeking a reset in relationship. His government's desire to renew strategic dialogue has so far gone unanswered, despite Georgia's consistent backing of U.S. regional goals over the past 2 decades. At the heart of the tension is the so-called foreign agent law and the MEGOBARI Act, Washington's new legislative tool aimed at influencing Georgian domestic policy. But in Tbilisi, many see it as an affront to sovereignty and a shift in tone from ally to overseer. Is Georgia being unfairly punished for asserting independence in its policymaking? Or is this a necessary recalibration of Western standards? With us tonight is Richard Hoagland from the Caspian Policy Center, joining us from Washington. So, Mr. Hoagland, warm welcome to our program. And let me start with a question. So, what messages does Georgia's foreign agent law send to its allies?
I think what it sends to the allies is that there has been a shift in how Georgia sees itself in the world. In the past, indeed, as you said, it was much closer to the West. It had strong aspirations to join the organizations of the West. But now it's a little bit more equal, and Russia is playing a bigger role behind the scenes than it has in the past. And that seems to be quite a change in how things are seen there.
Well, Mr. Hoagland, critics say that Washington's concern is selective. The United States has long tolerated warfare from closer alliances in the Gulf. Why the double standards now?
That's a very good question, but rather than having a double standard, I think we might talk about triple standards and quadruple standards. What I mean by that is that there are dramatic changes in U.S. foreign policy under the current administration of President Trump. That doesn't mean that there is an overall ideology that is guiding every foreign policy bilateral relationship in the world. But what it means is that there is more likely going to be a shoot from the hip kind of policy, making things up as the events happen. The problem is that in this Trump administration, the president has not surrounded himself with real foreign policy experts as he did in the past, in his previous administration. This time, there are fewer people around him who really know the deals. Also, American embassies in the countries are keeping their heads down. They want to keep a low profile so they don't draw attention to themselves and perhaps have things happen that they wouldn't like to see happen. So it's a wait and see situation more than anything else.
Well, the MEGOBARI Act, can this act actually strengthen the democracy in Georgia?
Oh my goodness, I don't know if it can really strengthen democracy or not, because the hard fact is that the United States, I believe, has less influence in countries around the world than it did in the past, except for those particular countries where the president has a personal interest or if his family have business interests.
So when it comes to Georgia, what kind of interest, more in details, United States has?
At this particular time, I think the only thing that we could talk about would be Georgia's role in the middle corridor, the online or on land transportation route from China across Central Asia, across the Caspian Sea into the South Caucasus, and then onward into Europe across the Black Sea or through Turkey. The middle corridor is not at this point a major policy issue, so far as I know, for this current presidential administration, but that is probably one of the things, more than anything else, that could draw U.S. attention to Georgia and to the region.
Then it means that we should expect the rapprochement between two countries. And probably your personal opinion as a former diplomat, sanctions itself, how do you think this policy of Washington might be effective? Probably sanctions may backfire, fueling anti-Western sentiment more rather than the expected results.
Well, you're entirely right. That's what happened in the past. But the situation right now is that the current presidential administration, with its foreign policy, tends not to use sanctions except to get what it wants. And that's almost exclusively in the economic sphere. It's not in the political sphere. It's not in the bilateral foreign policy relations sphere. It's about money. Money, money, money. And so, in the end, Georgia does not have that big of a role to play in all of this.
Previously, I also mentioned the letter. Why has Trump once silence on Kobakhidze's letter actually raised eyebrows? How do you think? Why did it attract so much attention?
I suppose I really don't think I am qualified to comment on that very much. I think it might have drawn attention in Georgia much more than it drew attention in Washington. But I think that's the only thing that I can say at this point. One other thing that we need to remember is that President Trump has a much more positive view of President Putin of Russia than the United States foreign policy has ever had in the past. And so what that's going to do is make President Trump himself think, probably when he does think about making decisions for the region, about his relationship with Russia and with specifically his good friend, President Putin.
So here already we bring the case with Russia, the relations between Georgia and Russia and United States and Russia. Do I understand correctly what you want to say?
All I am saying, I don't want to be misunderstood. All I'm saying is that in the past, the United States foreign policy focused very much on Georgia's interest in joining eventually the West, whether it was NATO or the European Union or its role with the OSCE, things like that. I think that those things right now are under less consideration in the White House than they were in the past. If anything, it's more of a quiet, equal relationship, and it takes into account Russia's interests, which were not taken into account before because Russia was seen as an adversary, and that seems to be no longer true.
So for now, by following some decisions and processes which we observe in Europe as well, can we say that U.S. preferred Georgia to be closer with Russia or not to be? Or as you previously mentioned, United States prefers not to go deeply inside this issue?
I think more than anything else that it's that the United States at this point does not prefer to go very deeply inside this issue. Let's keep in mind that I am no longer in the U.S. government, and so I can't tell you what I know from the inside. I'm on the outside looking, just as everyone else is doing these days. But this is what we seem to see. This is what the analysts seem to say.
Well, my next question, how does the United States justify suspending the strategic partnership?
I'm going to say that it seems as if this administration does not ever need to justify anything. It makes decisions, it takes positions, it acts, but it doesn't then have people scratching their heads in the background, talking to the analysts on television and saying, here's why we did it, all of that. It's more what we call in English, shoot from the hip. You make a decision without thinking too much about all of the possibilities that might go wrong.
But what we see today, don't you think that it looks a bit like the situation when Washington is using democracy as a political weapon?
Well, in the past, when I was a U.S. ambassador, I was quite well known for not being in favor of U.S. policies of what we call naming and shaming, demanding that other countries be like us, demanding that their democracy must come above all other things. The fact is that these countries in the South Caucasus and in the Caspian region in general have a very different history, a very different culture from the West, and certainly from the United States. Does the United States support democracy? Yes, because we are a democracy. But I think we don't need to try to hammer the table hard and demand that countries must be like us. In that sense, the Trump administration is probably positive for the countries in the region.
Well, and from your perspectives, how can Georgia rebuild trust with Washington?
Well, we are lucky to have a good ambassador in Tbilisi. And I hope that that ambassador is doing everything possible to send back good, solid background information about the positive aspects of the relationship to draw attention to Georgia. And that way the United States would be a bit more involved than it is at this current time.
That's indeed very interesting. But from another perspective, I guess Tbilisi, Georgia itself, is also expecting some steps to be done by Washington.
Well, Georgia might well be expecting steps to be done by Washington, but I have to say once again that at least in the larger scheme of things, the entire region, not just Georgia, and I'm not picking on Georgia, the entire region is not of special high-level interest to Washington at this particular time.
So I do remember when previously I used to talk with some policymakers and analysts from the United States, they were telling me that there is no precise strategy the United States is following when it comes to the region of the South Caucasus. Do you expect some changes in near future? And do you expect with Trump's administration, the United States to have one single approach to the region where there are three countries, you know yourself, or there will be three different approaches?
I think in all presidential administrations in Washington, the United States looks at each bilateral relationship separately. It talks about regional policy when regional policy is of interest to the United States. For example, I mentioned already the growth of a middle corridor across this region and how that could be of benefit to the United States. But otherwise, the United States has relations with several hundred countries around the world and international organizations. And so each individual country is not going to be on the president's table every day unless there is a crisis happening. That's how foreign policy is done everywhere in the world. And that's the way it's done in Washington. If there is a crisis, there's a tension. Otherwise, it's day by day, step by step, and not very much changes along the way.
Well, there is a question which usually some experts prefer to challenge the United States itself. How perfect is the United States in order to have this power to affect the processes in different parts?
The United States supposedly has the power to affect events in other countries, in other regions, simply because it has been in the modern world perceived as one of the global powers. Global powers meaning Russia, China, the European Union, and the United States. Those four, especially in the former Soviet Union countries, those four nations were seen as playing a role in the sense that they were competing for the interests of the capitals in each of the countries. I think the United States is stepping back from that at this time in this part of the world. Whether that means it's of absolute policy change is too early to tell. We're still in the very, very early days of this presidential administration, and we have to sit and wait and watch and listen carefully where things are going. It's not very clear at this point.
Well, you already mentioned some countries which can have a particular interest for the United States, like all of those who are lined across the middle corridor, including the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, the countries in Central Asia, and China. Well, allies from Baku to Tashkent, of course, are watching what's happening in between of Washington and Tbilisi. So if Georgia can be sidelined overnight, who's next?
You know what? Diplomats have always been taught from the very beginning, American diplomats, you don't comment on questions like that because you are almost certainly going to either draw a negative headline or get it wrong. So I don't think I'm going to talk about which country might be next at this point.
Well, and another tricky question I would like to say, what happens if Georgia pivots toward non-Western partners?
I think if Georgia takes a less pro-Western position, it would not be overly dramatic. It would not declare that it is in the inner sanctum of President Putin's foreign policy directives for the future. It is what's happening right now. There is a political party in power in Tbilisi that has not unfavorable views about Moscow. That's not, in the larger scheme of things, over a longer period of time, that's not overly dramatic. Over the years, over the decades, relations change. They shift back and forth. Now, I think we should consider that in the future, there might be another political party that comes to power in Tbilisi that would look more favorably towards Brussels and to Washington. But you have to take the larger scope of view, the larger point of view, that these things go back and forth.
Well, Mr. Hoagland, thank you so much. Thank you for joining our talk today.
It was my great pleasure, and thank you for your very good questions.
Well, the message from Tbilisi is clear. Georgia wants to reset its ties with Washington, but will the United States listen? As fault lines widen across Eurasia, the cost of silence could echo far beyond the Caucasus. For Inside Politics, I'm Anastasiya Lavrina, and see you next time.